All right, today we're jumping into a moment that truly redefined an entire nation. India's massive economic shift in 1991. It's an incredible story of being on the edge of collapse, making some incredibly bold changes, and totally rethinking how an economy should work. So, let me ask you this, just to set the stage. How close can a country really get to a total economic meltdown? Well, for India, back in June of 1991, the answer was 2 weeks. Just 2 weeks. That's all the time they had. The country had only enough foreign cash on hand to pay for 2 weeks of essential stuff. Things they absolutely had to import. Just think about that for a second. The tank was basically empty. And it wasn't just a single issue. On top of having critically low foreign reserves, inflation was just soaring, almost 17%, and the government was spending way, way more money than it was bringing in. It was a total perfect storm, honestly, and it was threatening to drag the whole economy under. So, the big question is, how did India manage to pull back from the very edge? That's what we're going to break down today. We'll look at just how bad things got, then dive into the brand new economic policy they came up with. We'll see how that unlocked the economy, changed the government's entire job description, and finally, we'll get to the big idea driving all of it: economic freedom. Okay, so first up, India on the brink. And like we said, this was not just some small bump in the road. For decades, the economy had been super tightly controlled. They even had a name for it, the license Raj, because you needed a government license for pretty much everything. And after all that time, the country's finances were in a really, really bad spot. Something had to give, and it had to happen fast. Which brings us right to the solution: a new economic policy. Faced with a potential collapse, the government knew that just fiddling with the settings wasn't going to cut it. Nope. They basically decided to rip up the old rulebook and write a completely new one to save the economy. And check out the language here. I find this fascinating. The government's goal, in their own words, was to plunge the Indian economy into the arena of globalization. Plunge. What a word, right? It tells you this wasn't some gentle, cautious step. It was a full-on headfirst dive into the deep end of the global market. So what was the game plan? Well, the goals were pretty clear, and they were ambitious. Number one, get that crazy inflation under control. Number two, build up those foreign currency reserves so they'd never ever face that 2-week countdown again. And maybe most importantly, get the private sector more involved and, just unshackle the whole economy from all that red tape to really kickstart growth. All right, so how did they actually do it? How did they unlock this economy? We've talked about why they needed to act and what they wanted to achieve. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of how it all changed. The core concept behind everything was liberalization. Now, that's a word we hear all the time, but what does it really mean? It boils down to one thing: economic freedom. It's giving businesses and regular people the freedom to make their own economic choices instead of having the government control every single move. And here's how they made that idea a reality. First up, delicensing. They just got rid of the need for government licenses in most industries. Next, they abolished something called the MRTP Act. That was basically a law that made it super hard for big companies to grow or merge. Then you had trade liberalization, which made it way easier to import raw materials and parts. And finally, they threw the doors wide open and started encouraging foreign companies to invest in India. Let's zoom in on that foreign investment part for a second, because it's a great example. You can see the journey right here. In 1991, they started by letting foreign companies own up to 51% of a business, which, believe me, was a massive deal back then. A little later, that limit went up to 74%. And now, in a lot of areas, it's 100%. The gates have been completely opened. And check this out for another huge change. Before 1991, the government ran the show in 17 major industries. After these reforms, that number got slashed to just 8. And today, it's down to only 2: railways and atomic energy. That is a gigantic shift toward letting private companies in on the action. Okay, so if the government wasn't going to be in charge of everything anymore, what was its role supposed to be? And this gets us to a really fundamental change in thinking. The government's new job was to shift from being a controller to being a facilitator. And this really says it all. Before 91, the government was a controller and regulator. After 91, it became a facilitator, coordinator, inspirer, and supervisor.
I mean, to put it simply, the government's job wasn't to put up roadblocks anymore. Its job was to build the highway and let the economy drive.
So let's bring this all home. Let's talk about the big idea behind all of these changes: economic freedom. Because this wasn't just a random grab bag of new rules. No, it was all guided by one powerful central idea. And that idea? Well, it's not new. It goes way, way back. The source material we're looking at actually connects it to Adam Smith and his famous book, The Wealth of Nations. He argued that economic liberalization, that freedom, is the best way to grow an economy and improve people's lives. And really, the 1991 reforms were India taking that classic idea and running with it in a really bold way. All right, let's jump right in. Picture this. It's 1991, and India is on the brink of an economic collapse. In that moment of crisis, the country made a decision that didn't just rescue its economy, it completely reshaped its destiny. And we're not talking about a minor adjustment here. This was a total overhaul of its economic philosophy, one that paved the way for the powerhouse India we see today. So that's the real question, isn't it? How on earth do you turn around a ship that big? The answer is a revolutionary set of reforms called the New Economic Policy, or NEP. This was the playbook that was designed to unleash India's massive, untapped potential. So, here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the revolution itself. Then we'll dive into the three big pillars that held it all up: liberalization, or opening the gates; privatization, basically changing who's in charge; and globalization, which is all about joining the world economy. And finally, we'll see how all of this led to the rise of some truly massive corporate giants. Okay, let's get into the heart of it. The new economic policy of 1991 was the master plan. It was specifically designed to pull the economy back from the edge by tearing down decades of government control and throwing the doors open to competition and, crucially, new investment. The entire thing was built on three core pillars. And here they are. You can think of these as the three legs of a stool that propped up India's entire economic turnaround. To really get what happened, you have to understand each one. So, let's kick things off with that first pillar, liberalization. First up, liberalization. Honestly, the best way to think about this is like taking the handcuffs off the economy. For years, Indian businesses were just tangled up in red tape, and liberalization was the act of finally cutting them free. So, here's the bottom line. Liberalization was all about the government taking a step back. It was about systematically reducing the number of rules that told businesses what they could or couldn't do. The big idea was to let the market, supply and demand, drive growth, not a government permit. And this wasn't just some vague concept. It involved very specific, concrete actions. They dismantled the infamous license raj, a system where you needed a government license for pretty much any kind of business. Suddenly, companies were free to decide how much to produce based on what customers wanted, not what some government quota said. And some of these old rules were, just incredibly specific. Take the Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act, or MRTP. Under that law, any company with assets over 100 crore rupees was automatically hit with heavy restrictions on its growth. Getting rid of that was a huge deal, because it finally let bigger Indian companies invest and expand. And this one slide just perfectly captures the change in mindset. The old law, FIRA, was all about regulating and restricting foreign money. The new law, FEMA, was about managing and encouraging it. That simple word change from regulation to management signaled a massive, fundamental shift towards being open for global business. Okay, so let's move on to the second pillar, which builds right on top of the first. If liberalization changed the rules of the road, privatization was all about changing who was in the driver's seat. It was about shifting major industries from government hands to the private sector. Right. So the definition here is pretty straightforward. Privatization meant taking companies that were owned by the state and transferring their ownership, and this is the important part, their management, over to private players who, in theory, could run them more efficiently. And the main way they did this was through something called disinvestment. It's a fancy word, but it just means the government started selling its shares in these public companies. You might recognize some of the big names from back then, like the car company Maruti or the telecom giant VSNL. This brought in fresh money and, just as importantly, new business expertise. And you can see the results of this literally everywhere today. I mean, think about your phone. When the telecom sector was opened up, private companies like Jio and Airtel jumped in.
They invested billions, built these incredible networks from scratch, and completely changed how people in India communicate. That is a direct result of that privatization policy.
But privatization wasn't just about selling off companies. It also meant opening up whole sectors of the economy that used to be reserved only for the government. Now, a change this big obviously has its challenges. So to handle the transition, they set up boards like the BIFR to deal with struggling public companies and the NRB to create a safety net for workers who might be impacted.
So that brings us to the third and final pillar, which you could argue was the whole point of the first two: globalization. If liberalization opened the domestic gates and privatization changed the players, well, globalization was about knocking down the walls between India and the rest of the world.
The goal here was to create what you might call a borderless economy. This meant letting goods, services, and especially money and technology flow freely across India's borders. It was about plugging India into the global economic grid. Yeah, this image really says it all. The idea is to create one single connected global marketplace where anyone can trade and invest with anyone else, without a ton of barriers in the way. India was essentially putting up a giant sign that said, "We are open for business with the world." So what did that actually look like in practice? Well, limits on how much stuff you could import or export were scrapped. Tariffs, which are basically just taxes on imported goods, were slashed. And maybe most importantly, the economy was actively redesigned to attract foreign investment. Okay, now this leads us to a really interesting part of the story, because while India was inviting private companies and foreign investors in, it was also running a kind of parallel strategy. It was trying to make its own state-owned companies strong enough to go head-to-head with these new competitors on the world stage. And to do that, the government handpicked its best-performing state-owned companies. We're talking giants in oil, steel, and power, as you can see here, and gave them a special status called Navratna, which means 9 jewels. This gave them a ton of financial and managerial freedom to make their own decisions and compete globally. And this whole strategy has kept evolving. Today, there's an entire classification system. You've got mini Ratnas for smaller, profitable companies. And then, since 2009, you have the Maharatnas, the absolute behemoths that are being empowered to become true global players. It's all part of that same original goal, building corporate strength from within. Today, we're jumping into a moment that completely redefined a nation: India's massive economic revolution back in 1991. We're going to look at how a country, literally on the brink of total collapse, managed to pull itself back and completely rewrite its own future. I mean, it sounds like a drastic question, right? But back in 1991, this was the reality facing India. This wasn't some thought experiment. It was the real-life crisis that kickstarted a complete revolution in how the country thought about its economy. So yeah, let's start at the very beginning. Okay, so to really get why the changes were so huge, you have to understand just how bad the crisis was. Let's paint a picture of what India looked like right before 1991. So for decades after independence, India's economy was, well, tangled up in rules. Seriously, think of it like a giant instruction manual for everything. The government controlled what you could produce, how much of it you could make, even who you could go into business with. Now, the idea behind all this was to protect India's own industries, but it definitely came with a cost. And that cost? Stagnation. All these layers of control were literally choking the life out of the economy. It wasn't dynamic, it wasn't growing, it was just stuck. And this whole slow-moving system was about to slam right into a brick wall. And this was the breaking point. You see the term foreign exchange reserves here. Basically, that's the cash, dollars, pounds, yen, that a country needs to buy stuff from other countries and pay its bills. And India was down to just a few weeks' worth. Imagine your bank account having enough money to last for only 2 or 3 weeks. The country was about to default on its loans. A crisis wasn't just coming, it had arrived. So, with its back completely against the wall, the government knew it had to do something, and something drastic. We're not talking about small adjustments here. It was time to throw out the old rulebook and write a completely new one. And wow, was this new rulebook different. It was a total 180. All of a sudden, the rupee's value could float. Foreign companies, who used to be viewed with a lot of suspicion, were now invited in. The doors were thrown open for foreign trade, and there was a huge push to sell Indian goods abroad. And maybe the biggest change of all? That old, complicated system of getting a license just to start a business? It was pretty much dismantled. And if you want to understand just how massive this change was, look at this number: Before 1991, there were hundreds of industries that were only for the government, state-owned companies. After the reforms, that number was slashed all the way down to just two. I mean, that's a gigantic shift toward a more open, privatized market. So, the big question is, did all this radical surgery actually work? Well, let's start by looking at the good stuff, the big wins that came from opening up the economy.
And the results in some areas were just stunning. I mean, these reforms didn't just solve a financial crisis. They kind of accidentally kickstarted India's whole digital future. The IT sector just exploded, basically turning India into a global tech powerhouse. Private banks came in and totally changed the game for finance, bringing in things we all take for granted now, like credit cards and online banking. Exports shot up, and because it was easier to import things, all those chronic shortages of goods that people had lived with for decades, they started to disappear.
But it's never that simple, is it? This story isn't all sunshine and roses. Anytime you have a massive economic shift like this, you're going to have losers as well as winners. So it's absolutely crucial that we look at the other side of the coin. And this new openness, it came at a really steep price for some. Suddenly, you had cheap imports flooding the market, and a lot of small local businesses just couldn't compete with the giant multinational corporations. At the same time, services like healthcare and education started getting privatized, which meant costs went up for regular people. And when those local industries couldn't compete and had to shut down, well, unemployment went up. There was even a real fear that with the new focus on crops for export, the country might not be able to grow enough food for its own people.
Let's just take farming as a perfect example of this divide. On one hand, these reforms were a huge win for richer farmers. They could switch to growing high-value crops for export, things like fruits and flowers. But on the other hand, for poor, small-scale farmers, this new competition was absolutely devastating. They just couldn't keep up, and many ended up facing crushing debt and poverty. It really was two completely different stories happening on the very same piece of land.
So when you step back and look at the whole picture, what you get is a really complicated legacy. You just can't slap a simple label on the 1991 reforms and call them good or bad. It's not that black and white. And the summary here really lays it all out. You look at IT and finance, and the upside was nothing short of a global revolution. But then you look at agriculture. Yes, you had new markets and more variety, but the downside was that poor farmers got left in the dust. And for local industries, sure, they got access to new foreign partnerships, but that came with the brutal downside of intense competition and, for many, unemployment. It was a story of creation and destruction, often happening at the exact same time.